Siaran khas ini kami bawakan kepada anda seiring dengan Forum Ekonomi Dunia WEF 2024 musim panas yang diadakan di Talian, China. Dan hari ini hari pertama, beberapa siri perbincangan berlangsung sepanjang hari ini dan antara yang menarik untuk saya bawakan adalah perbincangan melibatkan Nurul Izzah Anwar yang merupakan pengerusi bagi Social and Economic Research Initiative ataupun SERI, di mana perbincangan adalah berkait dengan dari segi pembangunan, apa bentuk pembangunan yang boleh diimpikan dan diharapkan apa yang boleh dilakukan terutamanya dalam mendepani cabaran, pelbagai jenis cabaran yang berlaku pada ketika ini, dari krisis iklimnya, dari segi jurang sosialnya, termasuklah dari segi jurang ekonomi. Pada masa sama, kita tidak boleh pinggirkan isu-isu berkait sekeliling, iaitu krisis geopolitik yang masih lagi membelenggu global. Dan apa kata kita dengarkan sesi perbincangan antara Nurul Izzah Anwar bersama dengan Alessio Terzi yang merupakan ekonomis ataupun ahli ekonomi dari Cambridge University, dan juga Vera Songwei yang merupakan pengasas dan juga pengerusi bagi Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. Kita saksikan sesi perbincangan tersebut.
Thank you, Alessio. Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. My name is Nurul Izzah and I am honored to speak to all of you today together with Dr. Vera. And my main question is, how does multidimensional poverty index better support social and pandemic recovery in a post-pandemic world? Help us better measure so that we can reimagine development better. So I'm going to speak on the virtues of using MPI, that's the acronym, as a tool that is responsive to shocks to a nation, whether it's a pandemic, a natural disaster, or the ongoing genocide such as in Gaza. Many of us here have bounced back from the pandemic, but many continue to suffer. Now, in parts of Malaysia where I'm from, we try to understand COVID as a phenomenon through the multidimensional impact on lives. And then I'll suggest ways to address the scarring in the pandemic and welcome your feedback. Now, my first term, which Alessio didn't mention, as a politician, as a member of parliament, I didn't do 12 focusing on policy, but it mattered, taught me the importance of accurately measuring poverty. It's not about income alone. I met kids from socially deprived homes facing challenges in attaining quality healthcare and education. So my team and I actually found numerous youth failing exams across the board, leading us to start a community empowerment program, tutoring program, resulting the E's and F's to A's and B's. In my third term, we were all hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that's when I joined forces with Malaysian economist Professor Fatimah Kari to implement a multidimensional poverty index study sampling the low-income households at the height of the pandemic in my then constituency of Permatang, Pauh. Indeed, our study was just a snapshot, but I would argue a useful, rare picture in time. And as you can see in the UNDP's 2023 Global MPI report, you have share and number of people living in poverty by region. But it states that although this report makes best use of existing data, full data from after the COVID-19 pandemic are unavailable for all of the 110 countries by the global MPI. So unfortunately, the data revolution seems to be leaving multidimensional poverty data behind. So truth is, we are living in a new post-COVID reality. But hardly enough studies, research exists to cover just how much the pandemic kind of affected us all. Over 20 million casualties, over more than 65 million afflicted with long COVID, trillions lost from the global economic shocks. Big businesses, of course, recovered, but SMEs still struggle. And I would argue, just like long COVID, shocks shouldn't be ignored or allowed to go on facing underinvestment. MPI matters, and this measurement that we studied helped us quantify the needs of low-income households. We used, of course, conventional measurements like savings post-income, basic infrastructure, but additionally, we added 3 more COVID-related measurements. First, the loss of employment and incomes due to the pandemic's economic and school closures. Number 2, comfort within the homes, because not all homes are big enough when you are stuck within the 4 walls. And number 3, stable internet and sufficient hardware to ensure all children gain access to online learning. So looking at income alone will not tell you these things. Long-term socioeconomic scarring is a global phenomenon that we're all facing. Now, we actually found a few conclusions. Number 1, single mother households disproportionately affected by the pandemic, as heads of these households had to balance caregiving with breadwinning. Their children suffered intergenerational poverty, which means the first child was better off than the fourth, including through food poverty. In terms of rate of unemployment, 36% was unemployed, only a third formally employed, and out of those, 24% had 0 safety nets. So a lot of them are living precariously as well as informally. And single mom-headed households earn $145 less than the average family income. So we're talking about, usually it's at $307 per month. So while the survey took place in 2021, the scarring from the pandemic remains, particularly for poorer households. So these are a few suggestions that we would like everyone to consider, and as I wait your feedback. During the pandemic, many Malaysians actually depleted their savings in order to manage immediate needs. So female-headed households took the worst hit and still face challenges in obtaining equal pay, not to mention work in the formal sector. That's why we have to enhance social safety nets, ensure affordable and comprehensive healthcare coverage, improve educational and digital access, as well as expand opportunities to upskill and reskill. For those who remain in school, great, but for those who have left school, and that's why there's a focus by Malaysia in empowering youth through technical and vocational education and training, as well as empowering women in the workforce. A lot of incentives are introduced to ensure that we reach 60% women participation in the labor force. You need employment with meaningful wages. But I think it's also important to mainstream families, blended or single-headed, in policy making and budgeting. Single-headed households face more deprivation, and prioritizing their needs help mitigate intergenerational poverty and trauma amongst children. Now, COVID-19 started as a virus that humanity was underprepared to face. It ended up exposing the inequalities in our societies. These fault lines remain. Before the next crisis or pandemic hits us, we need to strengthen our societies, understanding the multidimensionality of poverty and the multidimensionality of interventions is one way to do that. So we shouldn't be lulled into complacency. Now that there's multiple crises besetting the world, the MPI becomes all the more important as a tool. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks, Nurul. I think Nurul set up the conversation really well, coming a little bit from a micro perspective and talking about the impact of COVID on, okay, yes, it's happening. The impact of COVID on populations. I'm going to take it from the top. At the end of the day, it's the same problem that we're dealing with, which is what do we do when we have disparities, when we have inequalities, and how can we solve those problems? It is about resources. It is about measurement as well, and we need to do a lot more of that. On the screen, you see 3 slides. I'm going to talk about something that we're all very familiar with. We just came out of elections in Europe. I think many people sort of ascribe some of the results of the elections in Europe to the tractors. This was the farmers' strike because of the European decisions to do a little bit more of the green. We need $5.3 trillion if we need to do poverty reduction, education, health, infrastructure, and of course fight the climate crisis. But all of these are intertwined. You can't do one without the other. There is no longer, well, we need to invest in education. Investing in education is investing in climate. Investing in climate is investing in education. The middle slide is Pakistan. Of course, the floods, but it could be Kenya, and even just recently, last week, it could actually be Ivory Coast. Because even in Ivory Coast, we also saw last week deaths. We've gone from, on the continent in Africa, droughts in East Africa, and to floods now in East and West Africa. And of course, we have the Sahel. We're looking at the third picture. It could be New York, and it could be the burning flames coming from Canada. So again, from Europe, the center of the conversation, to Pakistan, to Africa, we are all suffering from the same case. And we have to remember climate change is a global problem. It is not a problem that one can solve in one part of the world and hope that it will be solved across. It is a global common. We must take it as that. However, unfortunately, while we're in the midst of probably what is the biggest challenge that humankind is going to have to face, there is an 80% chance that between now and the next 5 years, we will actually hit the 1.5 planetary boundary. That is how close we are to it. This is according to the Secretary General in his latest op-ed, where he talked about, how close we are to the crisis. While global climate efforts are increasing, emerging markets are under a lot more strain. We are under a lot more strain because we're facing obstacles growing out of the COVID-19 and how the world responded to it, and particularly the advanced economies. In the advanced economies that we have looked at normally to fund a lot of what we need for climate change, the energy transition, as we know, requires anywhere in the order of about $400 billion annually to be able to actually make the transition. But for many of us in the developing world, in Africa in particular, in Southeast Asia, it's not just the energy transition, it's energy access. There's almost 660 million people that do not have access. Then there is the whole conversation around adaptation and resilience. We need another $250 billion annually to make sure that that happens. Loss and damage, fantastic results coming out of COP28, actually beginning with COP27 in Egypt, where finally a fund was decided. In the UAE, there was a decision about how to implement and fund that fund, but we know that the $100 billion that is supposed to go into that fund has not yet been fully pledged. Nature, 12% of global GDP comes from nature directly. Businesses make profit directly from nature, but 65% of our ecosystem has been depleted if we look back between today and 100 years. So these are the risks we are facing. As many of us know, many species are going into extinction. And these species are the ecosystem that essentially ensures that the world can continue to exist in the way we know it. But the problem is, many of the people that we have turned to say, let's help collectively solve this problem, has always been aid. We've gone to aid as the sort of solution. We've looked at the G7, we've looked to the G7. I think many of us were reading sort of the G7 communique to see what came out of Italy and what was going to be said and how much was going to be pledged. But in all fairness to the G7, because of the COVID-19, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the climate crisis as well, because populations do not necessarily agree with increases in taxes, we see that a lot of the G7 countries are under strain. Debt to GDP levels, when I stand here normally, I'm talking about debt to GDP in Africa being unsustainable and countries being in debt distress because they are at 60%, 70%, is mostly because they cannot service the current size of their debt. But look at those numbers, 123% debt to GDP in the United States, 255% debt to GDP in Japan, 144% debt to GDP. Most of the European nations have bridged the fiscal rule. And so a huge conversation that is happening in France today is about bridging the fiscal rule and seeing how one can recontract, and that is why some of the subsidies to the agriculture sector were taken away. Yes, there was also a climate conversation around that. But this is a tension that we are facing, is where do we get the resources to struggle to fight the inequalities that are being caused by COVID, to make sure that we can manage the COVID-19 pandemic, to make sure that many of the kids that were not at school during COVID can go back to school, but also that the climate crisis that is racing towards us. As Nurul said, and we said in the IEG report, the world is on fire. But the world is on fire, and the people who normally should be providing the water hoses are running out of water. And so where is it, how can we collectively begin to respond to this crisis? And that is the big issue. 23 of the advanced economies are responsible for over half of the CO2 emissions historically. So, and we say 23, when you eat 23, over 11 or 12 of them are in Europe, so you take all of that out, and then you have the United States, Canada, Australia. And so essentially, again, it's the countries that we go to for support, it's the countries that we go to for funding. These countries that are historically responsible for CO2 emissions are now today under stress. They don't have the resources to be able to respond adequately to the problem. More than 150 countries are responsible for the other half. The tension in the conversation is also that the 150 countries that are responsible for the other half are also beginning to become high polluters. So when we look at India, we look at Indonesia, we look at Vietnam, we look at South Africa that are still using coal, there is still quite some emission coming out of those countries that we need to understand how we can provide resources for them to transition. They are hard to abate sectors. There are sectors where, yes, we want to transition, steel, cement, housing. If housing was a country, it would be responsible for 7% of CO2 emissions. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of research that needs to go into how do we transition. A lot of work is happening with hydrogen. How do you transition? But it requires resources. Where do we get those resources? We all know where we can get those resources. One of them, of course, is the special drawing rights. Special drawing rights, as many of you know, are resources, fiscal resources, money creation that happens collectively. It has been mandated from the IMF, from creation 60 years ago. It has been issued 3 times. The first time in 1973, the second time in 2008 with the crisis, and again with the COVID crisis, 650 billion was issued. Of the 650 billion that was issued, only about 5% went to, 5.5% went to the African countries, about 4.2% went to IDA countries, which is the lowest, poorest countries in the world. About 17% went to emerging and developing countries. A lot of those resources stayed with the advanced economies. The advanced economies gave themselves $20 trillion during COVID to see how they could get out of the crisis. To respond to the climate crisis as well, we see the IRA, we see Japan giving itself a stimulus, we see China giving itself a stimulus, but we know because the climate crisis is a common crisis, doing innovation just in the United States or doing innovation just in China is not good enough. We have to be able to share and create a global governance platform that allows us to do this in a way that works and in a way where we can share actually this innovation so transition happens faster. And when we drive around today in Dalian or in Beijing, you see all those green cars. There's more and more EV cars. Can we share the technology? I think during COVID, again, and this is, we talked a lot about sharing the COVID technology or to make sure that everybody could have access to vaccines. We should be saying the same thing for climate change. Any new technology that is needed to move us from one climate state to the next one and protects us and reduces emissions is what we need to share. And I think and I hope that as we begin to have these conversations on how we create new global governance systems, climate has to be at the center of that conversation on how we make sure that in 5 years we don't hit 1.5%. What does it mean hitting 1.5%? It means, as we saw in all of this, a lot more hurricanes. The small island development states essentially get flooded, is what we are looking at. If you're Barbados, you get hit and 40% of your GDP with one hurricane disappears. We all know that if you have the resources today to fight climate change, the cost of putting resources into climate change today is cheaper than if we waited a few more years. So we do need to make sure that we can put the resources into climate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot for those presentations. I'll invite you back on stage as soon as we have the chairs. But perhaps already a few reactions as I was watching or listening to your presentations. It so happens that I've worked on both your topics coming from different angles, let's say. And so I've been working on this so-called agenda of going beyond the GDP. And I saw some echoes in what you were presenting, Nurul, in terms of saying we cannot only focus on GDP as an indicator, but we have to broaden and look at other things to get a better picture of poverty. But come ahead and join me for this conversation. And so perhaps starting from you, Nurul, is I'm going to play the nasty economist, which is what I usually receive as a critique when I present something along the lines of what you present for a developed country setting. And so what people tell me is, you know, yes, we can use other indicators, but at the end of the day, what you're going after in your case is poverty. And so that GDP would, to a certain extent, capture what you're capturing. And the fact that poor communities were more exposed to COVID, that they did not have access to the internet, or that they could not homeschool as much, is a reflection of poverty after all. And so that with one indicator, you could catch more or less everything that you're going after with this multidimensional indicator. What would you say to this kind of critique?
I think the issue now goes beyond knowing that people are poor. But for governments, for even those involved with government, it's about literally how do you resolve this problem. Yeah. You know, you are talking about the election results worldwide. It's becoming clear that populism, the fact that people feel really affected by COVID, and they're taking it out through the ballot box. So it is incumbent for governments to ensure there's a degree of social or socioeconomic stability, and making sure this hard-earned money or this limited amount of fiscal space is spent more targeted, more to meet the necessary stakeholders in a more, you know, kind of robust manner matters. So I think the issue is if you talk about just income, okay, let's just give cash transfers. You know, don't worry about it. And to be fair, that is being utilized, right? As countries, including Malaysia, talks about the issues of, you know, unproductive subsidies, diesel or petrol subsidies. People do consider the element of cash transfers. I don't deny that. But then you take a look about your limited space in the healthcare ministry. How can they better plug in the needs of the lower income group, right? And sometimes I feel you have to take a citizenship paradigm. I think Stephen Kidd talks about this. You feel that you are perhaps, you know, I'm T20, everyone here T20, so I will not be in a vulnerable situation, but you could be perhaps involved in a car accident. Oh, but guess what? There's not enough sufficient support for you to live a life, you know, with disabilities. So I think that's why it really matters, because there's impact, there's good outcomes, there's limited fiscal space, and also no one will ever be exempt of challenges, and never, you know, you're always going to be vulnerable to shocks one way or the other.
Vera, just one quick question. You finished off by saying, you know, there's no money, and the place where we can look for it is SDR and a reform of the SDR. how far, and this is something that we hear a lot, and the reform of multilateral organizations, how far do you think this can go? As in, you presented the numbers which are massive in terms of adaptation and mitigation needs, both for developed and developing countries. The SDRs are a small pot of money. I mean, they're large, but they're small with respect to the challenge. How far can this go? And if that's not enough, what else can we do?
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a good question. So the report that I co-chaired, the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance with Lord Stern, and in that report we say you need $2.4 trillion to be able to annually to be able to respond to the climate crisis, and of which 400 billion needs to come from the multilateral development system. And so what I didn't say in the presentation is what we will do with SDRs is we'll take, if we reissued $650 billion of SDRs, you should take 100 billion off the top immediately. It's taken us 3.5 years to try to get 100 billion to the IMF, which we have not yet succeeded in actually getting. But now that there has been a historic decision from the IMF that we could actually, SDRs remain a reserve asset even if they go to regional development banks, we could actually take immediately the SDRs are issued, take 100 billion off the top from the advanced economies, the 23 up there, and redistribute them, some to the IMF, some to the World Bank, some to the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the Caribbean Development Bank, and all the other prescribed agencies, because they are already prescribed receptors of the SDRs. What they could then do is leverage those resources with the private sector to do a lot more. Today, the private sector issues about $175 billion just in climate-related bonds. The MDB segment only issues $47 billion because they don't have enough resources to do more. So imagine if we were able to crowd in the private sector with the public sector with these resources. One, we buy down the cost. Secondly, we bring in, what we need is not trickles of 3.5 years for the Resilience and Sustainability Trust of the IMF to be able to allocate to a few countries, of which only less than 100 million has actually been disbursed of the resources that have been given. We need a huge, quick injection of resources. This is what the SDRs can do, and that's why they're the most important. Of course, we need to look at domestic resource mobilization. We need to look at investing more, investing better, ensuring that productivity increases. And finally, there is the whole conversation around carbon credits and whether we can use some of the resources in a good, I believe, compliance-linked carbon market environment, and I think Europe is leading the way with that. I think the voluntary market is important to set the standard, to build the integrity, but eventually we need compliance to deliver the kinds of resources that we're looking for.
Very good. We have a few minutes for questions. Raise your hands if you have anything you would like to ask to our panelists. And if not, I mean, I can go on for hours.
One of the things, when we talked about even the issue of, carbon credits and so on and so forth, that kind of graphic you showcase everybody in terms of historical emissions, it really relates back to the issue of just transitions. Why do people talk about the importance of multilateral organizations? Because people feel that it's quite unfair. And I think redressing that, of course, concretely, will help us also provide for a more, I guess, stable world environment. Because as the resource becomes more scarce, you're going to see a lot more crises take place. And this is why it's not just climate related, but I feel that we should really be quite scared. We had a conversation earlier before the forum started. And honestly, it's like we're living not just on borrowed time, but there's so many things that have gone wrong, that will go wrong, that should compel us, even private sector, to just do that bit, and not just perhaps plant their carbon elsewhere.
I guess that's the alarm calling us to order. Perhaps the only thing I'm going to say to that is that what makes me wonder is, I agree with everything you're saying, both of you, in terms of what the future looks like in terms of the resources we need, in terms of the climate impacts, the fact that the shocks will affect rich countries and poor countries, although the latter more so. But I wonder if this is the environment that will pave the way for greater collaboration, for a greater role of multilateral organizations, or if instead there is the risk that we're going to see more and more of these national populist or nationalistic governments clashing for resources and not paving the way. Nonetheless, I think that the message that you are channeling is the right one, and so thanks a lot for doing so at the World Economic Forum, and have a nice rest of the afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Vera.